All right, hey guys, I'm Ted, and I'm back to give you another lecture. And we'll be picking right up where we left off. In our last lecture, we discussed Andrew Carnegie and the steel industry. Carnegie, of course, was a Scottish immigrant who became the most well-known of the steel industrialists. He was well known, of course, for founding the Carnegie Steel Company that played a dominant role. Well, not really a dominant, but a very prominent role in the United States Steel Company, in the United States steel industry, and became a core component of the later United States Steel Company. Uh, and and really Carnegie sort of pioneered a lot of the cutthroat, take no prisoners business practices prominent amongst his contemporaries in the late 19th century. Um, he was well known for modernizing and continually updating his factories. He brought in a scientific element to steel production. He did away with the ad hoc method by bringing in actual chemists and physicists, men who better understood the chemical process of creating steel, so that he can so that he could put out onto the market a better quality product. He was also well known for updating or renovating his factories to better suit the ability to exploit raw materials, the raw iron ore. When the great iron deposits in the Mesabi Range in Minnesota were discovered, he converted most of his facilities, most of his factories, to open hearth methods because the iron ore coming from the Mesabi Range is very high in phosphorus and not well suited for the Bessemer converter. So, in order to more fully exploit the more abundant iron ore and steel deposit, to basically almost have a shot at having a monopoly on being the main the main recipient of the ore coming from that area, he converted his factories. And with that being said, on Carnegie, I'd like to jump right into our next lecture, and that is the steel, not the steel, the oil industry. Sorry about that. Now, just like steel, oil was an emerging vital commodity in the late 19th century. Before 1865, the main source of oil for the United States and really the world was whales. Oil was used to power lamps back then, and the whaling industry provided this oil. From New England ports like Nantucket, whalers would go out in search of schools of whales to prey on. Now, the book Moby Dick is a great source for really understanding old-time whaling practices. To sum up a whale hunt, back then a whaler or a whaler's fleet would spot a school of whales. You would then lower a rowboat, which would row as fast as it could out to the whale. The harpooner would then harpoon the whale, which would take off and, in a panic, dragging the rowboat along. Now, that little excursion was known as the Nantucket Sleigh Ride. And as soon as the whale would stop, the harpooner would once again harpoon the whale. And this continued until they managed to kill the whale. The main vessel would then come along, and they would begin the process of breaking down the whale carcass. The whales were skinned and the blubber converted into oil using long, intricate, and very dangerous processes. Really, they would simply just boil everything down. They would boil down the skin and boil down the blubber to get to the oil. That would then be stored below in great barrels below deck. Now, the dangers of the whaling industry, coupled with the overhunting of whales, led to what was then known as rock oil production. Oil, as we know it today, was originally known as rock oil. Now, the domestic production of oil began in earnest at Titusville, Pennsylvania, in 1859, when two men really named one named George Bissell and the other named Edmund Drake began to drill especially for oil using a salt drill. Now, salt drilling was an early industry in the United States. Back then, you had to drill for salt. It was a very prominent industry back then. The technology developed for its use was converted for the oil industry. Now, an early use for oil, for crude oil, was as a medicine. Indeed, there was a patented medicine that involved crude oil and opium. It was a crude oil opium elixir that was said to have very profound effects on those who intook it. And that was really the chief use for rock oil or crude oil, was as an elixir. Now early oil had seeped up from the ground, which was an annoyance to farmers. But now with the drills, huge gushers, as they're known, were being exploited. Now the early oil industry obtained the oil from the gushers, but it was very difficult for them to refine that oil. And really, an enormous amount of oil was wasted at Titusville. Now, early refinement included a process that was essentially boiling the oil and removing the thin layer produced at the top. That thin layer was called kerosene. Now, kerosene replaced whale oil as a lamp fuel, and you can still buy kerosene oil at a number of stores. As a matter of fact, when I was younger, we still had kerosene lamps. Now the rest of the oil was discarded, had the waste product. Gasoline was later found and was later used as a local anesthetic. Before they even were cars, they used gas for anesthetic purposes. Natural gas, which was also being viewed at the time, had the potential illuminant. Was also minorly exploited, but the majority of the product was wasted, and kerosene was the real draw for the early industry. Now, initially, it was easy to make money with little effort or equipment, but as resources were exploited and the need for heavy machinery increased, a more industrial and systematic approach had to be undertaken to make a profit in the oil industry. Now, just as Andrew Carnegie was essential for the development of the steel industry, so too was John D. Rockefeller central to the development of the oil industry. Rockefeller really made the oil industry what it was to become. And at the time, Rockefeller was simply a Cleveland businessman who specialized in grain, meat, and produce distribution. Rockefeller built his fortune and a company on refining oil. He would later abandon the grain, meat, and produce business and go exclusively into oil. He realized that the fiscal nerve of the oil industry was in refining oil, not locating or extracting it. Far more oil was being extracted than could be refined. Rockefeller realized that as more oil, as you extracted more oil, the more the price would fall, and that was true. In 1859, when the oil rush first began, a barrel of oil cost $20. But 2 years later, in 1861, a barrel of oil only fetched about 10 cents. Rockefeller was an outstanding organizer like Carnegie, but his business techniques and innovations were what really made him successful and memorable to this period. Now, Rockefeller's chief concern was quality. He wanted to make sure that he made a product consumers would be confident in. He eliminated his competition by either buying them out or merging with them. He wanted to avoid competition and price wars. To eliminate early competition, he would drop his prices so that his businesses would run at a loss, undercutting his competition until their businesses failed, at which point he would buy out the competition and raise his prices again. After the buyout, Rockefeller would keep the former owners on as managers, bringing them into the fold of his company. His techniques for eliminating his competition grew as his share in the market increased. Now, Rockefeller often worked in conjunction with the rail lines, and the rail lines offered him secret rebates that allowed him to undercut his competitors. Now, Rockefeller was able to do this because of the sheer size of his operations, which increased very rapidly during the 1870s and 80s. Rockefeller Company Standard Oil had a very clear monopoly on oil refinement. It is estimated that 90% of the United States crude oil were produced by Standard Oil refineries during that time. And Rockefeller used his monopoly to control the oil business, controlling everything from prices to how much oil went on the market at a given time. Now, Rockefeller also used his monopoly to create business and industry stability by ensuring constant supply at constant prices. Rockefeller is in many ways a paradox. Much like Carnegie, he was a great entrepreneur and innovator, enriching the industry many times over, but he was also dead set against competition, believing competition to be unsettling and detrimental to business. Now, Rockefeller pioneered vertical integration practices. After becoming involved in the refinement process, he very quickly went into gaining ownership of oil fields. He moved into the distribution, buying oil pipelines, which was which he was one of the first to invest in. At first, oil was transplanted from the oil teams by teamsters, and teamsters were simply men with draft animals and wagons who moved the products. Rockefeller moved to create the first pipelines, and these first pipelines were wooden, and would later be replaced by stronger ones made of steel. Now, the reason Rockefeller went to steel pipelines was because teamsters, noticeably very angry by having their livelihoods threatened, would simply go in and break the wooden pipelines in retaliation. Rockefeller also moved in for, he was also one of the first to create oil tankers. And the oil tankers were used for transporting large quantities of oil by rail. He manufactured his own barrels and, of course, his kerosene containers. He slowly but very steadily brought in every stage of the oil business, and in doing so, kept the profits for himself. Now, Rockefeller was also a sober and deeply religious man. He was noted for being a Sunday school teacher, and he lived in near constant fear that the oil supply would run out. You have to remember that this is still the late 19th century, this is the late 1800s. They didn't know about the vast oil fields that will be discovered in the 20th century. He didn't know that there were any other oil fields. He only knew that there were oil fields in Ohio and Pennsylvania that he was exploiting. It wasn't until the 20th century that oil fields were discovered elsewhere, most notably in Beaumont, Texas. And these were deeper, larger oil fields. With these discoveries, Rockefeller was assured, he was reassured of the future of his company. Now, under Rockefeller, Standard Oil also pioneered the use of universal marketing and distribution. Now, the way this worked was that Standard Oil, the way this worked out for Standard Oil was that a customer would buy Standard Oil's red can every week, and every week the Standard Oil delivery man would come out and fill your can. The delivery man will be wearing the Standard Oil uniform. It was a red uniform, and he will be driving a horse-drawn tanker with Standard Oil on it. Very clear marketing, very clear on what to expect, very clear on the price. Now, Rockefeller also increased the safety of his product. Remember, he named his company Standard Oil, and he wanted his company to set the standard in the oil industry. Early kerosene lamps were known to explode. They contained a number of impurities. The oil had impurities in it, and the impurities would cause the reaction, an explosion really, that gave a lot of customers misgiving about using the product. Rockefeller pioneered practices that made explosions and house fires less likely. Indeed, using Standard Oil products, you were almost guaranteed that this would not happen. Rockefeller, that enabled Rockefeller to control the oil industry And its control really was so complete that by the turn of the century, by 1900, he began to reduce his prices because there simply wasn't a need to keep prices that high. The price of kerosene, for example, dropped 25% by 1900, or 25% cheaper than it was in 1865. Rockefeller also engineered a rise in the quality while steadily lowering the price. When the first automobiles were being developed, their creator tried a variety of means to fuel them. Steam was an early choice, but oil soon became the standard choice. Rockefeller also influenced the railroad and the merchant marine, that is the ships, the shipping industries, to abandon coal and switch to using oil. Remember, coal had been the primary fuel for the railroad industry and for ships. All these ships had to have large amounts of coal on them. Rockefeller convinced them all to abandon coal because he could sell them oil much cheaper and in larger quantities. Rockefeller capitalized on this and converted from providing an illuminant to providing lubricants and fuel for these emerging industries. And with that, we'll break on industrialization, and we'll come back with our third and final lecture on industrialization before we begin to our discussion on industrial labor practices. And as always, hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you guys thought about this lecture.